Welcome, everyone. This is Ariyeh Korvah, the they, them of mayhem. Joining me today is my boss, Julie Muncy, she, her, and my step boss, John Warren, he, him.
That's fair. Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
I'll take
yeah.
it.
You can't tell me what to do. You're not my real boss.
hmm
But
Yep.
publisher still gotta be nice to you.
hmm
Yeah.
Well, yeah, today we're going to be talking about Interstate 35, hear more about these two interesting guests, professional experience, inspiration, and provide a little, background and insight into the making of the game. So, yeah, thank y'all so much. So, I want to start off with I recently learned something the hard way, which is that people do not read more than the title. I titled something like The Fruits of Our Labor, and people were expecting fruit, and it was like more esoteric. So, to not make the same mistake, if y'all could have just, top headline, what is the game? Julie, can you describe if someone wants to play Interstate 35, what are they in for?
Yeah. Interstate 35 is the first game from Radiant Array. It is, I would call it an experimental visual novel. It is a game of interaction and reading, and it is a story about a young woman going home to the irradiated ruins of a speculative sort of near apocalyptic version of the Dallas Fort Worth Metroplex in Texas, which is why it's called Interstate 35, because that is the highway that goes right up into and through um, Dallas and Fort Worth, Texas.
I love it. Yeah. And John, making a game about Texas, publishing this, did that feel like an easy choice? What was your thought process of taking that on?
Yeah, I mean, I was planning on publishing a few games since I left my last job, and Julie kind of pitched me on the entire premise, and I'm kind of a sucker for Texas media generally. I'm from the area. I'm from the Metroplex. By the time this game came out, I had actually moved back to the area, so it was a very um, it was a very kind of it was a very interesting series of coincidences that made it exceptionally easy to say yes to the project. One of those things being that Julie's just an amazing creator and writer, and so it was really easy to go. Okay, well, this is going to be an interesting project. So yeah, it was not a difficult decision to make for sure.
Wonderful. Yeah. So I know both of y'all were in the kind of video game journalist space. Have y'all worked together, collaborated prior to this?
Um, we we didn't work together directly, but I wrote a
No,
couple of things for Fanbyte, which was John's previous job. We don't need to get into Fanbyte, but
pour one out for Fanbite. That's
yeah,
fine. Yeah,
yes. So we had been sort of in each other's orbit for a long time, and sort of lots of shared colleagues and friends. And I worked
yeah,
for someone who worked for him a couple
yeah,
of times.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
so I was just aware of Julie from those published articles, from published articles elsewhere, and also just a lot of rave reviews of working with her from people I really trusted. So it was yeah that's been our working relationship before then.
Wonderful. So, Julie, how did you make the transition from video game journalist critic to leading your own studio?
Yeah, I mean, it does feel a little weird to frame it like that because the studio is mostly me. But with that said, it's yeah. I mean, I really like criticism and writing about video games, but that was never really my first love or what I wanted to do with like my entire life. I like criticism. I don't like doing journalism. I'm okay at it, but I never enjoyed it. I find it very stressful. Please, God, don't make me call a source. I hate that stuff. I've never liked that stuff. But, I've always been interested in creative writing and poetry and storytelling. And that and having a lot of experience in the industry, knowing how video games worked, having learned a lot about game design and just being passionate about it, it made a lot of sense to me to, use all of that to try and tell stories in this medium that I enjoy and find really interesting. And this specific project started as sort of a small scale portfolio piece that took on a life of its own. And when I had written it, it was longer and more involved and also better than I expected it to be when I started writing it. And the people who I showed it to were like, this is great. And so I'm like, okay, well, in that case, maybe this is worth trying to figure out how to release this commercially. And from then, I linked up with John and sort of started up my thing that way.
So you said it was a portfolio piece. So at the time, had you made the decision to try to lead your own studio? How did that happen?
Not at that point. I think the idea was that it would be something to have, in my pocket to apply for games writing jobs elsewhere. The idea of leading my own studio, that sort of thing, wasn't really fully in my mind. Because for one thing, I'm not a programmer. I understand the logic, but none of the languages. I can't, write any code. So it didn't seem approachable to me at first, but then when this idea started taking on life of its own, and I'm like, man, if I could get this in a presentable format, get some music with it, I think this could end up being something really cool. I started looking into how I would do that, and so I wrote it in Twine, which is a program that's really good for writing interactive narratives and basically requires no code or no anything. But it's difficult to publish a sort of complex multimedia thing in Twine, both because Twine is generally built for web, for HTML, and I was hoping to put something up on Steam, not because there's anything wrong with web apps, and there's so many brilliant Twine games, but just where games are, it felt like if I wanted attention, then Steam seemed like the place to go. And so I then started looking into, well, maybe what I want to do is take this text and put it into another game engine. And can I figure out enough of a game engine to be able to put this into that and make this, mechanically light text game work in a game engine? And I was eventually able to do that. And so from that point, it was, I found that I'm able to do this thing, at least passively, enough to accomplish what I want to accomplish. And I found myself really, really enjoying it. And so it's like, yeah, maybe this is my thing. And that also coincided with the horrifying collapse of the professional large-scale video game industry, which meant that the idea of trying to find a games writing job just seemed less than practical. It seemed more practical if I wanted my work out there at that point, that I should probably just start making things.
So I want to say I am very grateful that you did not try your hand at art, because you try to make a portfolio piece, knock it out of the park, try to first time do programming, and you create a video game. You have gotten a lot of positive feedback for what seems to be something that was not calculated to be in this final form, but nevertheless has resonated with a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, and I really appreciate that. And like it's a thing where, it's not a big smash hit, but everyone who's played it has loved it basically, and like it's gotten really great accolades. Like obviously we're doing this for Ludo Naricon, which is such an honor, and Pace put it on their best of 2024 list, and like yeah, it's the reception has been way more than I would have ever hoped for not just this project, but for like my first game. And yeah, yeah.
And John, for you,
Yeah.
this is also your first game that you've been a publisher for, is that right?
Technically, no. I had a studio back in this was ages ago. My resume I would say is like unclear, honestly, if you just kind of looking at my surface. But I had a studio in Austin. We made 3 games in 4 years. I quit that. I went out to LA to be a consulting publisher on a different game, um, and and got that published. So I've published 4 games prior, but had never stepped into a role of I'm not working on this game creatively. I am basically here as support, be it financial, be it back end, be it whatever, to make sure that Julie and her team are doing, the things that they need to do. So definitely my first time of being like kind of out of that space and kind of away from that. Um, I enjoyed this aspect of it, which was just like knowing that like all the really smart creative decisions were just like completely out of my hands. It was really freeing to just like be delivered a new build or new piece of information or new art or whatever and just go like, yeah, like that's great, cool, like keep doing that, that's awesome. And then what we eventually released was, like you said, very well received. Like we just, it's like people are putting things like Norco and Disco Elysium in like reviews for this game, and I'm like, it's really hard to ask for kind of a better first impression
Yeah,
for
serious.
obviously Julie's studio, but also kind of my first um, foray into kind of being a singular taste bringer to kind of the table of saying like, okay, I this is my taste, this is like what I want out there. Yeah, we knew this was not going to be some sort of financial hit, although I will say, frankly, I think we've done better than we expected to on that front as well. Um, but I just wanted it out there, and so for my first game in that role, um, it's kind of hard to ask for, something better than that for sure.
I'm thinking that both of y'all have been in the industry a while. Did that make it easier to trust each other, to let go of control a little bit? How was that for y'all?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, John talked about having gotten positive reviews from um, people in his circle about working with me, and it was the same for me. I had friends who were employees at Fanbyte and just had done other stuff with John, and were like, "Oh yeah, John's great. I would take a bullet for John." And I'm like, "Okay, yeah." And yeah,
Fortunately, we didn't have to do that. Julie did not
no,
have to take a
no,
bullet for me, which is great. Like
but
we
yeah,
didn't, no bloodshed happened, which was great.
yeah,
But yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
It was an easy arrangement.
yeah. It was super easy for me. Reputations kind of follow. This industry is like it's huge. Obviously, like the 300 people lost their jobs at EA like earlier this week. So it's like you think about like, do you know 300 people? Like maybe not. That's such an enormous amount of people just in one segment of this industry. So it is large, but it's also incredibly small in other ways. And I think reputations follow people very closely in this industry. And I've been fortunate enough to work with people who seem to like me enough to talk about me in that way. And Julie is cool enough that people talk about her the same way. So, yeah, it was an easy arrangement for sure.
Yeah.
And thinking that this is a very small scale operation.
Yeah.
Are there things about the game that you think would not exist in its current form if y'all had been attached to larger studios?
I mean, I think it's, the shape of it is it's a very specific and personal thing, and it stars a queer woman. And, those kinds of things are often difficult to make and difficult to pitch. And also, just like it's a mostly text based game with minimal choices, it's very much sort of focusing on the interactive experience of it. And I think, that would have been a difficult thing to sell for a lot of traditional publishers within that system because, like, there are certainly games of this ilk that succeed, but it's not necessarily a financial best bet. And a, even small indie publishers are often, they have to run a pretty cutthroat business to keep their doors open. And it's like, can you guarantee a return on my investment? The answer is no. I could not. It was like, I'm doing this because I think it's interesting, not necessarily because I have any idea if it's going to sell anything at all. And so that sort of gamble is difficult to find space for where the industry is right now, especially now. It was true, a year ago, but it's even more true now, unfortunately.
Yeah, I would say I would say that I would echo what Julie says in the sense of like I don't know what this game looks like if we had 10x'd the budget or 25x'd the budget. Like there are genre mishmashes that we probably could have dived into and hired more developers and had this kind of like real time scavenging like you can see it if you play the game you can kind of see where it could be something different in a different kind of expression. But I don't know if you get kind of the closeness, the kind of the intimacy of this game if you expand it outward. I want to be very clear. This game was made for almost nothing. It should have been made for 4 to 5 times more than what it was, just in terms of like paying people fairly. But I think in terms of where the budget was and kind of what the scale of the game ultimately was, yeah, I mean this feels kind of right in terms of like how it ended up. Certainly if we had if Julie had taken this to like a bigger publisher and they had said yes, I think the expectations of what the game ultimately needed to be would have been really different. Like I said, from a brass tacks, cold calculation perspective, I looked at this as saying like, I think this is cool enough to exist without worrying too much about the return, which is a really privileged position for me to be in. I want to be very clear about that, but also this game has a long tail. It's going to have a long tail forever, as long as it's on the Steam store, as long as Gabe doesn't go crazy and sell it to Microsoft or something. Like, I think this will be a thing that just stays up for a long time, and we'll see pockets of new people being introduced to it every year. And I think, the idea that this can return its money and then some is actually not crazy and not out of the realm. And I think it's kind of exactly the size it needed to be.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think, if I had brought this finished product to most publishers, they would have treated it like a vertical slice. And
Yes.
and have been like, well, okay, now you need to make a bunch more game around that. And
Right.
I could have. And like now that some time has passed, I've been working on more stuff. I have more skills. It might be fun sometime to go back and like put together a definitive edition that expands some things. That oh god, that would be cool and fun. But like, it's not something that ever needed that. And I was really grateful to have the luxury to not have to add anything more than what it was. Like I was very adamant that with the small exception, I didn't really want voice acting, which is something that probably a lot of publishers would have absolutely insisted on if they were ever willing to buy something like this in the first place.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Julie, now that you mention the collaborators, so obviously I did the backgrounds in the game, and if y'all wanted to pay me 20 times as much, happy to accept that. But yeah, Julie, how did you find people to work with you on the game? What was that process?
Well, it started partially from just showing the game to people. Like you and I have been friends for a while, and I showed you what I had, and you thought it was cool, and you started making art. And it's like, okay, well then, yeah, let's work together on this. You were inspired by it. Things just happened naturally there. As for the music and the illustrations, I shopped around for a few people, asked some friends regarding the illustrations, and landed on Persephone Cavalinas, who also goes by Porcelain Bones. Persephone did some illustration work for, I think, a Kickstarter reward for Heather Flowers' Extreme Meat Punks Forever Volume 2. And that stuff was really good and just was kind of the style I was looking for. And so I reached out to Persephone, and we just vibed immediately. And for the music, Josie Breckner is brilliant, and Josie is always who I had in mind. I was initially familiar with Josie's work from, again, their work on Extreme Meat Punks Forever, a great, like, small visual novel series by my friend Heather Flowers. Fantastic stuff. And Josie's just mix of very, like, catchy and enjoyable video gaming music, plus the ability to incorporate, like, the regional elements and just that kind of sound. Like when I was writing it, I was thinking, if I have budget, what I would want that budget to go to would be a soundtrack by Josie. So that was an easy choice, and they happened to be interested and available, and so that worked out. I also ended up working with KM Nelson, helped with QA and editing and some production stuff. And that is, again, just someone that I know personally that ended up being interested and ended up being a really good fit. I feel like I got really lucky with collaborators. Like everyone was amazing. And just, I sort of got my first choice for everybody, which was just great. Yeah, I feel very, very blessed about who I got to work with and the work they turned out.
And you all mentioned that, the protagonist is a queer woman. A lot of pretty much everyone except John on this project has some kind of queer woman vibe somewhere. Not speaking for you, John. You can
No, no,
absolutely.
no. I don't go here. You're right.
Yeah. We have several non-binary people on the team. I'm a trans woman, and yeah, it was actually absolutely a very queer little collective that emerged around making this, and that really, I think, was exactly what it needed to be, and that was great.
Oh, and then, John, do you consider yourself an insider in the video game industry, the video game media? How do you think of yourself there?
Do I think of myself as an insider? Boy. Gosh. To some extent, yeah. I mean, I have a lot of relationships with publishers, media figures, executives, across multiple disciplines. I've kind of, yeah, I mean, I've gone from developing to publishing to media side at a conglomerate to now having a games hardware startup. So it's like, yeah, I'm kind of been everywhere in the industry, and so yeah, to some extent, I would.
So, all of this extensive experience, was there anything about the queerness of this project that appealed to you?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think some of the most profound projects in this space, really, frankly, in any creative medium, that have spoken to me at some level, have been made by queer people. I think like more opportunities for queer art should be bountiful, and out there, and also should be paid for, and also should be a way to make a livelihood. So I think, I've made it a habit, whether consciously or unconsciously, to surround myself with marginalized people in this space, because um, often they have to work twice to 10 times as hard to get the same kind of pay, to get the same kind of opportunities, all that stuff. Whatever I can do to kind of amplify those voices is really important to me. Um, and also, I don't know. I generally think a lot of really great art in the game space has been made already, but will be made, by queer women, especially, kind of stretching well into the future. And I'm just happy to be a very small part of that, and then to kind of get out of the way and be like, "Hello, this is great. Please play it. It's really good. Give them more opportunities."
John, I know you mentioned now the hardware startup.
Yeah.
So was that something that was presented to you? Was that something that you felt a need for and found, and it just also kind of clicked? Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so the hardware startup is called Glider, GLYDR. We had a Kickstarter last year. It went well. We're gonna we're gonna ship these out pretty soon. Although tariffs has certainly complicated, a budding hardware startup here in the U.S. But we're still chugging. No, the idea was brought to me by one of the co-founders a couple of years ago. He had basically built it for VR, but I immediately kind of saw it more as a games peripheral specifically, and we marketed it that way. And it's a really cool, super versatile device. And yeah, I don't think I had it on my personal career bingo card that I would kind of be involved in hardware like even 3 years ago. So it's definitely a kind of a shock. But it's something that I'm enjoying, and it's my day job at this point. And helping Julie make this game was just a little side thing for me.
Yeah. And thinking that the controller, so it is control using your feet
Your
as well. Is
feet,
that correct?
yeah, yeah. It's a foot-based controller, that you use to, you can configure it kind of however you want, up to 16 different actions. And yeah, it's really neat. It's plug and play, compatible with like every PC game. I have genuinely clicked through Interstate 35 with a glider. There's not really much to it; it's just you're clicking your feet at that point. But it's a super versatile device, and yeah, I'm excited to get it out on the market this year.
And then, Julie, thinking about accessibility, were there
Mm.
different concerns and considerations for that with I-35?
Yeah, I mean, I did my best. A lot of sort of accessibility development. You know, there are a lot of affordances that I would have loved to include if I had more technical knowledge to be able to. But you know, I think the big thing for me was making it visually readable and also making the text not freaking tiny. There are so many games that are games that require massive amounts of reading, where all the text is crammed into like an eighth of the screen, and I just find that really frustrating, and it's also extremely inaccessible. And so, making it both visually appealing while also making sure that the prominent text design elements were visible and readable on small screens from a distance, that was all really important to me. I did a lot of testing on PC gaming handhelds because I like those platforms, and also just because there's a really good they're really good stress tests for like, well, how actually readable is this screen when you drop it down to like 8 inches, you know?
Uh, John, are there any developments in the video game industry that you feel is just made for a certain type of person with a certain type of physical, mental skill that is just maybe missing the mark and needs to be scaled back a little bit?
Like, you mean, what? Explain that a little bit more
So I
before I
know,
answer it incorrectly.
yeah. So Julie mentioned the text size
Yeah.
shrinking. So I know there's visual things like that. There are sometimes combat where you do need to use your feet, maybe your elbows as well, to properly fight a boss.
Sure.
Have you noticed anything like that emerging?
I mean, from an accessibility standpoint, I feel like we've seen some good developments in games on the studio side. Oddly, a champion of good accessibility stuff has been Ubisoft, which is like kind of one of those wild, like, oh wow, okay, like they got this right. Um, in order to kind of make combat easier, accessibility easier. To Julie's point, like so many games ship with text size that is bonkers. I mean, for my 40-year-old eyeballs, just that just have a plain old astigmatism, it's harder and harder for me. Fortunately, I-35 is like a totally legible game on Steam Deck, like really easily. It's really nice. I think there are a lot of like Armored Core 6 was a game that I picked up and very specifically was like, I don't think I have enough fingers on the gamepad to do most of this stuff. Like it's really, really complicated. So that's where I've kind of seen alternative devices and accessibility. Maybe not macros, but thoughtfulness about how to make a gamepad mapping or like a combination of gamepads or keyboard and mouse. I've seen some like more interesting mapping styles come out of games like that because they're just so unbelievably complicated. So games where we run the gamut. Even as something as simple as I-35, like could have run into serious like accessibility issues if there wasn't a lot of contrast in the text or if it was super small. And then something as complicated as I don't know, what have I been playing lately? Uh, Claire Obscure with all the super super close timing based parry stuff while you're managing all this other stuff. Like there's always something that comes up in games that strikes me as being inadequate for the controls that we use. But yeah, it's hard to come up with a single solution for everything.
And then I know the development of video games is often this black box where people, assume it goes a certain way. So for you, Julie, how did you manage? How did you figure out the development of this game?
Yeah, I mean, not easily. It's, a fairly simple game to play. The development was very challenging. And because, I was learning everything as I went. And I'm not a programmer. I don't have that background. My background is in writing and literature and criticism. So for me, there was a lot of leaning on specific tools that exist that let you do things without programming. There's this visual scripting application for Unity called Playmaker that what was extremely valuable to me. I know a lot of professional devs
Yeah.
use Playmaker that lets you, do scripting without code. So learning tools like that and figuring out their limitations and, just figuring out how all of those things fit together was a large part of the development process. I feel like at this point, I could probably make something of the complexity and shape of I-35 in half the time that it took me initially, because I spent
Yeah.
a lot of that time learning how to do it. And yeah, I think that it's the way I thought about it at the time is that I didn't need to understand how like Unity worked or how like all the things worked. What I needed to understand was how to do the specific thing I was trying to do at that specific point. And if I kept applying that to every problem, eventually I would solve enough problems to have a game. And that actually worked. So yeah.
And John, hearing the not necessarily having all of the programming skills, is that something that you were aware of? Is that like,
Oh
oh,
yeah. Oh yeah. No, Julie did not come to me with like I know C sharp. Like
Mm-mm.
that's no. I knew the scope of the game. Like Julie was really clear about what the scope of the game was. So it wasn't like I knew what tools were out there at her disposal to make something. When she had said, "Hey, I want to shift this to Unity," that was not like a big. I think that was like a 15-minute conversation about like,
Mm.
like, okay, what are we going to use to migrate this? Like, what are we using to really make the all the narrative connections and all those things. Um, the ecosystem is like pretty robust right now if you're not like a total expert at programming. Um, like like the only benefits we really would have gotten is, if Julie was a programmer with a game of this scale, it's like, okay, now like the backpack is like a thing you can just open and close, like, and actually see inside and rummage around, and like whatever. Like there were small gains from having this kind of knowledge for a game of this scope. So like I was not concerned about that at all. And even from like a troubleshooting perspective, like I don't want to be so, I don't know, arrogant to say that like, okay, if you've like worked around the industry for a long time, you just know how to make a game. But I will say, I think like,
It's that simple, folks.
I will say though, like a certain kind of person who is thoughtful and takes the time to really like criticize and examine something, they can kind of piece that together better than I think the average person that's floating around in the industry. And I knew that about Julie, so I was like, okay, I think this is like a safe bet. There was also part of it that was like, I knew enough that like if things had like really gone south for some reason, I could have, found people or stepped in and done a couple of things, and like probably would have been okay. But like I was never, I was never like worried about that, or even we didn't even have to come close to doing anything like that. So yeah.
Yeah, and like I will say there are a lot of really good reasons to not use Unity as their game engine. Their business model
100%.
is concerning, and they have a tendency to change licensing agreements on the fly in ways that should probably be illegal.
Probably. Yeah.
But what I will say about Unity is that there's a really vibrant ecosystem of tools and like guides and like plugins for the engine that make it extremely approachable for someone coming at it from maybe an art background or a writing background or a music background and not a programming background.
Yeah.
It feels like it was a space where I could learn at least that version of game design without having to go take like a Udemy C# class for six
Right.
months beforehand. Yeah, I
Yeah.
didn't have to go to coding boot camp, and and that's something that Unity is really good for. It's not the only thing that's good for that. I hear Game Maker is also really good for that, and Godot is getting better and better, though it's still a bit too programmery for me to really get my head around. But like, yeah, the tools that are out there making a game, I think, more approachable for more people than it really ever has been. And
Yeah.
even though so much is going wrong, that is still really cool, and that is a good thing that's continued to happen in the industry.
Yeah.
So, Julie, it sounds like you created art kind of by accident, then sort of had the momentum to turn it into a video game. So, thinking about this creation, was there any reason that you set it in Texas?
Yeah, I mean, Texas is always where it was going to be set. That's the core origin of the project. The images that started it were just thinking through that stuff. I think my first mental image was that first scene of these characters driving in a car, going somewhere, talking about the end of the world. And so then filling out the question, where are they going? Why are they going there? Who are they? And all of that, locked in for me and became a way to write about home because I'm from Texas. I've lived most of my life in Texas. I'm currently based in Austin, and it became a way for me to get at writing about things that I know and things that I care about and that resonate with me that I hadn't necessarily been able to get at in another way. And so yeah, there was no version of this project where it wasn't set in Texas. And also just personally, I feel like there are not enough games set here. I've always thought Texas is, you know, you look at how many games are set in like these interesting environments in like the Pacific Northwest and California and like that American landscape. And I think Texas has a lot of really interesting landscape to it, and a lot of interesting culture. And it just doesn't get a lot of attention in the medium in that way. And and so when this came together, I'm like, well, I just want a video game set in Texas.
Yeah. John, for you, was there anything that you also noticed, you being from and in Texas, that hadn't been addressed before?
Well, I mean, and I just did this just now because I was just like, yeah, you know what? I think Julie's right. Like, there really haven't been that many games set in Texas because I was like, off the top of my head, I was like the beginning of The Last of Us, and then but like it's so funny. The Wikipedia. I'm sorry for reading Wikipedia in an English. It's awful, but it's like F1 racing, Call of Duty, F1 Manager, Forza Motorsport. These are like sports games and racing games that just maybe have like a track in Texas. So to speak to Julie's point, culturally, I don't really know if Texas is really well represented. It's certainly well represented in books, in film, in television. And there are a lot of cultural elements of Texas that are represented. I think there is this kind of I would say a very outside looking in perspective of Texas that I think the rest of the country gets. When you see something political happen and something bad happens in Texas, which is more frequent than I would like to admit, you see a whole lot of like, well, this is what you get. You get what you vote for, blah, 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 blah. And Texas is a huge state, and it's full of wonderful culture from across the world. Um, Vietnamese immigrants in Houston, an incredible population of Mexican Americans and Central Americans who have migrated here and have woven this like beautiful tapestry, this diverse, wonderful place. Queer people are all over the state in rural areas and urban areas. Like it doesn't matter. Texas is a really beautiful place. It's my home, and I think any game that speaks to actually the cultural truth of Texas is unbelievably rare. And I felt like it was deeply important to have a game out there. If Julie had switched gears like in the middle of it and was like, this is set in Ohio now, I would have been like, I don't know if it has the same, if it resonates the same. This kind of wonderful mash of, frankly, talking about traffic and wow, there was camp set up in Cowboy Stadium, and there's all these cultural footprints that Texas kind of represents, that are sometimes very stereotypical, but also very unknown to people who don't live here. And I just feel like it's my home. It's a place that I feel very deeply about. And before even reading a word of Julie's script, I knew it would resonate with me on some level, and it resonated with me on many levels. So that's a long answer, but yeah, like the Texas of it all was important to me saying yes, and important to the actual text of the game. I feel like.
Yeah, and just to go off a bit more on that, it was in the writing, it was important to me, and I, worked to be extremely specific with how things feel, how I feel like the sky looks, that
Yeah.
specific drive that the characters made is so closely based on drives I've made that I had to go through and make sure I wasn't accidentally doxing anybody.
Uh huh.
Um, you know,
Right.
um, so it's very much based on lived experience of like having made that drive a million times, that like
Yeah.
4 5 hour highway drive, and like seeing the horrible but strangely beautiful like refineries and like fracking facilities in the distance, and just sort of all of these complicated feelings. It was really important to me to try to get at that experience as specifically as possible. And like I think of so many times, like even when things are set in Texas, like you'll see a TV show and like there's still El Paso, and I'll look and I'm like, that's Vancouver. That that
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that does not look like this would look. And so
Hmm.
trying to get those specific details right and really communicate that lived experience, getting kind of out of my body and into the game, was
Yeah.
really important.
Yeah.
Uh, And John, I know you mentioned a lot of structures like stadiums. Julie, you mentioned the refineries. It sounds like Texas has a lot of large, just architectural pieces that are noticeable, but also very alienating, very like, well, I can't really connect with any of them specifically. For y'all, when you think about the landscape, what kind of emotions come up for you when you think about that?
Yeah, I think that like one thing when people are talking about Texas, they think a lot about rural space, and there is quite a bit of that. But
Yeah.
Texas is also increasingly dominated by this big urban industrial sprawl. There's the Dallas Fort Worth Metroplex, which at this point is closer and closer to becoming one giant city that, like, if you put it all together, is one of the biggest urban areas in the world. And
Yeah.
then Houston is big, and Austin's not quite as big, but still pretty big. And so, like, there's this meeting place of this really vibrant nature, then with this big urban sprawl. Like, living in Austin, I'm next to Texas Hill Country, which, as the name implies, is verdant, it's hilly, it's really beautiful. And then you go north toward Dallas and Fort Worth, and you get to sort of the very low start of the Great Plains, and it's just flat sprawl everywhere, and like fields, and then urban sprawl, urban development. And and so there's a lot of that contrast, a lot of sort of this weird meeting place. And that is my rice cooker telling me that the rice is done. Thank you, rice cooker. Um, but this meeting place of really an open sense of freedom, and also the sense of confinement, both the sense of, growing up and living in these big urban spaces that just kind of don't end, but also there being it being a place where you can drive for 10 hours and still be in Texas. There's yeah, the contradictory kind of feeling stuck here and really free at the same time that I think I had a lot of growing up here. And I think that's a lot of the emotions I was trying to really capture, or that just came out, some of them despite myself.
Yeah. I think for me, growing up, especially here, I've also lived in Austin before, which is definitely a different vibe. But growing up in the Dallas area, that flatness can read empty or it could read full of possibility. Like vastness can be, you can fill vastness or you can look at it at face value and say this emptiness is going to eat me alive. And I feel like that theme is like really clear in the game of just kind of like this is a state and an area that um, can really be the best thing for you or the worst thing for you depending on how things are going, and it's expressed in these kind of um, flat ways of, you look out toward an urban area and you see a fancy skyline and a lot of hustle and bustle. You can look in the opposite direction and you can see for hundreds of miles, it feels like. um, you know that hidden behind all the light pollution in the big cities is hiding probably the most incredible skies that you'd ever be able to see. But you've got to drive that 10 hours to be able to see it. Texas is a, a confounding place, and it's full of contradiction. And I think like the big urban sequence, urban kind of pieces of architecture, our highway systems are tied up in these big, ugly knots up here, and our malls. We still go to malls here. Like, it's like Dallas is one of the only places I would say like, hey, if you love mall culture, we got like five of them you could go to that are actually still really busy, and then like 15 of them that are dying but won't ever actually close. So there's just a lot of like, I don't know if we're going to curse on this thing. I can bleep it if we want, but there's just a lot of bullshit up here, and there's also just a lot of like, there's just a lot of like sincerity to it too. It's a complex place for a complex game about complex people. And yeah, the Texas of it all again is, I think, a big important part of it.
Oh. And if we're thinking about some of the words to describe DFW, so sprawl, it is exploding. Was there something about it being the setting for the aftermath of, again, a atomic bomb going off that felt appropriate to how the city is today?
Yeah, I mean, that is a funny question to answer because at no point do I want to say that I want to drop a nuclear bomb on DFW. But with that said, I think it, I think like there's the Ursula Le Guin quote that's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And
Uh-huh.
I think how that often ends up is you imagine both at the same time. You imagine the end of the world. You imagine apocalyptic events as a way of thinking through the breakdown of this system. And so I think, it came from, and really the feeling is wanting to write about those urban spaces and what it felt like growing up there and my complicated connection to them and to like local religion and things like that, and wanting to come at it sideways a bit and to really lean in a more kind of metaphorical, mystical way where I could play with it. And what made the most sense for me was to move it into this apocalyptic space and then and to, fictionally blow it up. Because then that creates a thing where you can make the geography very directly tied to the feeling that you want, and you can like it becomes like what the Disco Elysium people always use the word psychogeography to describe how they thought of making their RPG in that space, and this is the same sort of thing, finding a way to transmute these concrete spaces into the feeling of them in a way that let me get at writing about them. And a lot of that tied up with feelings about capitalism and urban sprawl and cities and growing up in suburbs and all of that stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, that's it's a great quote. And I think especially for Dallas, it's true. Like the idea that a group of people from Highland Park would stop going to Friday night football games at high school football games and like spend $30 on a salad the next day to be seen at some fancy lunch place, like that stuff's never going to happen without some sort of inciting incident, right? And so again, I agree with Julie. It's not like I sit around ideating about blowing the city up, but it's a rich vein, I think, of kind of of analyzing what would happen to a group of people who I do think are uniquely unequipped for some of the challenges that would lay ahead of them if that were ever to happen.
Yeah, and the unequipped, are you thinking the density? Are you thinking capitalism is just you don't
I
need to acquire apocalypse
yeah,
skills?
I don't think there's like I think there's this kind of like there is this kind of giddy up vibe in pockets of Texas, but a lot of it is artifice too. So there's a lot of like bluster, like we saw in the '80s with this kind of economic boom of Dallas, and we saw all these financial district buildings blow up here, grow up here. I shouldn't use the word blow up. Since we're talking about something literally blowing up, but just kind of the sprawl started vertically here and now has expanded horizontally up to the Oklahoma border, out west past Fort Worth, south almost to Waco, east almost to Louisiana. And the people who designed a city structure to multiply for the sake of multiplication, I think would be uniquely unequipped in a lot of ways to deal with um, real disaster. Um, I do think there is a lot of Texas ingenuity. I do think there is, in pockets, I want to be careful because not everyone's experience is the same, but a lot of true humanity and generosity in some pockets of this place. But yeah, I think like the spirit of the people here, I do think are largely unequipped to deal with something like that for various reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like for me, I wanted to both get at the sense that there are people here who would absolutely, form mutual helping communities
Yeah,
and do things
100%.
together. And like the whole thing of the camp in the stadium, there's sort of that's kind of a micro utopian space kind of existing within this apocalyptic setting, but also the sense that I had before, but became even more firmed up, you know, once COVID happened, that, if something like that happened to a place like Dallas, it could just be abandoned. There's a
Right.
sense that just maybe nobody will come and do anything about it.
Yeah.
And when I first came up with the concept, I think honestly the first ideas of it were 2018, 2019, when I first had the first mental images. And I was thinking like, well, why would the city be ruined, but then there's civilization nearby? And it's like, well, and I thought, there's this old Batman story from the 90s where there's like a big earthquake in Gotham City and all the supervillains break out and the US government just like walls it off. And it's like, that's Batman's problem now. We don't care. And that is now no longer a part of the United States. And after COVID, that no longer struck me as unrealistic.
Mm,
And so it's like that sort of narrative problem for me disappeared. And then it became about the dynamics of that sort of the tension between community support and institutional
yeah.
Oh. And this idea of institutional abandonment, when you're in a city as big as the DFW Metroplex, there are a lot of chances for abandonment, chances for institutional neglect, even within something that big. Have y'all felt like DFW was a place that felt safe, caring? Did it feel like there was a lot of neglect throughout? What were your experiences?
Yeah, I mean that's a complicated question. I mean,
Yeah.
growing up there, definitely it's like it is definitely a place where it feels like a lot could slip between the cracks, and there's a lot of clear economic stratification, and like it's a it's a place where you can cross a block and the level of development, which itself is a problematic term and way to think of things, but can just change radically from one part of the city to another. And that's true for a lot of places across the world and across the states. But something that always sticks out in my mind as very clearly observable and clear cut in the urban areas of Texas. And so, you know, that sense of certain types of neglect kind of feel a little bit ever present.
Yeah, I grew up in a really affluent suburb of Dallas. So I grew up in a bubble where it's like, oh yeah, this place is safe. If you go into Dallas, it's a little less safe. And so it was always kind of measured against this kind of, completely unrealistic idea of what a place to live is really like. And also, it just was not very diverse. It was not very interesting in a lot of ways. And so, I think it kind of took me leaving the area, eventually moving to Los Angeles and living in Los Angeles, which is just an unbelievably complex group of people living together in this massive urban sprawl. That returning to Dallas, I really explored the city in a way that I had not previously, even in the 18 years that I was kind of living in the area. So yes, those pockets of abandonment and leaving areas behind, so to speak, they're very, very clear. And then, progress is measured by gentrification. And I would not say that that's a good thing. So there's this push pull where I am heartened by the continued diversity in the urban spaces in Texas. Now, I'll say Austin's a weird exception that's gotten whiter as it's grown. And that's also never good for various reasons. But like Dallas and Houston are deeply, legitimately complex places. And so, yeah, like there are pockets of these cities that are um, clearly on a different strata, but there's still places worth fighting for. Um, my impression of growing up in Texas is, I think, very, very different from a lot of people's. I took a lot of the wow, everyone's just so nice here. Like, I took that vibe with me everywhere until I was meeting people from the area who were like, yeah, it wasn't great for. I was growing up gay in a really bad area of town. Like, that wasn't great for me. No one was like super friendly, and like just countless stories like that kind of changed my own perspective of what it meant to grow up there. And now I see it a very different way. Um, but I still see some of that seeping through. It's a complicated place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I grew up a bit on the less affluent side, and it was, less affluent and more diverse. And then, like, I went to a more centralized high school, which was less diverse. And then I went to a liberal arts college in San Antonio, which was very affluent. And I was, the kid there on scholarships. And a lot of these kids were like international, the children of diplomats or whatever. And,
Right.
and,
Yeah.
and so, like, a lot of my experience growing up in Texas and then making sense of it is kind of a series of successive types of culture shock. And
Yeah.
that, you know, seeing that stratification and just how complex and diverse and strange a place it is, and moving from those different kinds of spaces was absolutely a big influence on me.
Yeah.
That's really interesting because when a lot of people talk about moving back to their hometown, there's often a sense of nostalgia, trying to recreate something. But it sounds like both of y'all came to the same area, but with a completely different view of the space.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And like for me, writing about it, there's definitely it's kind of a mix of nostalgia and resentment, and I think that comes out pretty obviously in the writing. I think it's interesting reading reviews. I've seen people comment reading the text as extremely negative on Texas as a place, and I've seen the opposite. And I think that's because that's all in there. And my feelings are very complicated, and moving into the sort of speculative apocalyptic fiction space was a way to really dramatize that sense of complication and that sense of alienation, and also that sense of being a queer person who didn't know they were queer until really adulthood, and so who grew up moving through spaces that now I may I might not be able to go back and move through the same way through religious spaces and just certain social scenarios where I wouldn't necessarily fit before, and really getting at that sense of alienation from my own past a little bit is part of what's coming out and dramatized. And I think a lot of the protagonists' feelings and arc in the game mirror that sort of conflict.
Yeah, I come from the resentment part. For me, comes from I feel like the world was hidden from me. Like the truth about the world was just obfuscated on purpose. Growing up in Plano, which is an affluent suburb of Dallas, like it just felt like, okay, this is the world. Being safe here and around all these people who are exactly like you, like this is the world. Do you like the world? And I'm like, it's all right. Like, sure, all right, cool. And it wasn't until I went to college somewhere else, and lived in a 4-bedroom apartment um, with a trans woman, uh, a lacrosse playing Mexican American who had been adopted by Irish Catholic parents in Dallas, to an Iranian immigrant, like living with them and having experiences with them and having my mind fucking blown by the fact that the world I thought was this little space in Plano, Texas, is so much more vast um, than I ever dreamed it could be. It was harrowing, but it was also like, exhilarating. Oh my God, I can never ever go back and see things the way that I did before. And now my parents still live in Plano. I go over there every Saturday to have lunch with them. I go back into the space and I just see this world that continues to obfuscate, I think, the real world from itself. And it's something I do feel a lot of resentment about, but it's also like really funny to me in a way too. Like, I don't know. I think it's probably funnier to me because it affects me less, but it just is so cartoonishly strange, um, that some pockets of this area would continue to operate that way.
And do you feel like Plano has a culture? How would you describe the
God, that's a
That is a
God, that's a
question.
funny question.
That is a question definitely asked by someone who has experience with Texas suburbs.
Yeah, no, for sure. Do I feel like Plano has a culture? Um, I mean, do I feel like turning on Bravo on at 7 p.m. at night and just kind of like zoning out? Like, do I think that's culture? Like, do I think like a Real Housewives marathon is culture? Like, um, do I think like paying too much for a Balenciaga bag is culture? Like, I don't know. I do think there. I want to be careful. I think there are deep pockets of culture if you're looking for them. There are there are there are there are restaurants run by immigrants who create unbelievable food and then frankly charge an arm and a leg for it to the people who can afford it in Plano, and they thrive because they've figured it out. I think that's culture. Like, that's culture. That's cool. I think that's amazing. Um, but I think there's a lot of kind of non-culture or like inert culture, I would say, that is occurring in Texas and in Plano. And then there's I think there's culture that definitely like exists. I think there's football culture and there's like a lot of stuff. But I don't think it I don't think any of it is artful. So I think my answer is kind of like the people providing the culture in Plano did not start there, and the people creating culture in Plano who did start there are creating things that I would say don't really translate outside of the bubble very well. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I find that also very interesting considering the camp that is in
Mhm.
Interstate 35,
Mm-hmm.
where it seems to be a deliberate collection of people who have stayed and created their own thing. Where it sounds like in a lot of places in Texas, that's not necessarily being sought out, that sort of creation and collaboration.
Yeah. It's like, yeah, the origin of the camp is like, I think one is that you see you see the imagery of like stadiums and those sorts of spaces being converted for other uses in post-apocalyptic settings, like in The Last of Us Part Two. There is the you know c- c- compound that is in a stadium, but it's this like semi-fascist military compound, right? It's like you see these things, but I wanted to come at it from a different angle and really think about, who would stay. And often it's the people who either have some baggage or who can't leave because they don't have the money, they don't have the places to go. And sort of what does that community look like? And what does it mean to sort of build a community on the edge of disaster? And look at it in a way that's not fundamentally pessimistic and violent, right? It's like a lot of it, again, I think the specific shape of the camp definitely influenced by my experience with the pandemic, where there was so much neglect, but also so much people were able to care for each other. And there were a lot of really cool things that happened and new kinds of communities and support networks like, mask blocks and like clean air organizations and community health stuff, all of that's sort of emerging and this kind of grassroots infrastructure building itself up, and trying to imagine what that would look like here and who maybe those people would be and how it would work. you know that's where that came about, and definitely that's where culture comes from. It's a grassroots thing. It's like the existence of Plano or Burleson, Texas, or all of these places are, they didn't emerge due to cultural forces, but due to economic forces, due to capitalism and urban sprawl and commuter jobs. And so building culture in places like that means, bringing it with you and building it. And I think, the camp really is thinking through kind of an idea about what that kind of looks like. Also, I just found the image of like a big like flea market commune kind of thing in a football stadium was really interesting. Oh, and the autonomous zone in Seattle, what that was called during, my brain is completely falling apart on this, but during the summer of 2020, that
Yeah.
was also a big influence there. So yeah, a lot of that being the shape it is, I think really is influenced by the pandemic and sort of what one saw about people and communities and activism during that time.
Yeah, I mean, I remember Hurricane Katrina and the Superdome in New Orleans being a place that did uh, a I'm not going to say a great job of protecting people inside from the elements and whatever. It kind of fell apart, but like it was, I remember that imagery very well um, from the news back in what 2005, whenever that was.
Yeah,
It was a long time ago. Um, and yeah, I mean, yeah, I was reminded by that as well. But yeah, I can definitely see how, yeah, I can definitely see how the pandemic influenced this narrative and this structure for sure.
And then to completely change topics, but something that I've been curious about. So, John, have you had great experiences with bees? What has your personal bee history been? Because I
I
notice
get
it
really
comes
I get
up a
really
lot.
f- I get fixated on stuff. I like I love the idea of bees generally. I think they're really sweet. Um, I love that they work together to solve I think uh, remarkably complex problems in nature. I think they are responsible for keeping most of the planet alive in a lot of ways. It's a very big responsibility that they carry. And a few years ago, I just got like really into the idea of like, okay, whatever happens to my cushy corporate job, um, I want the next things I do to feel really collaborative and positive and feel like we could do anything. So latched onto the bee thing, took it too far. I think I've got like so much bee shit in my kind of periphery that I'm kind of like, all right, dude, like calm down like a little bit. Okay, all right, here, reveal. This is an exclusive. I don't think I've shown this on camera. My wife got me this thing. It's a little bee marble that I just carry in my pocket all the time because I feel like it gives me good luck now. So
that's cute.
I don't know. I don't really know what it is. When I was designing the logo and name for Honeybee Rodeo, which is technically the label I use to publish games, um, I just love the idea of having this kind of Texas imagery, but with bees and um, yeah, I don't know. I latch onto something, and I'll get self conscious enough about it in the next year that it'll totally change, and I'll just be like, no, I'm really obsessed with like snakes now or something. Like it'll change, but for right now, I'm still riding the bee wave for sure.
That, yeah, that marble is a fantastic reminder, like not only of the bees, but of someone that loves you enough to
Yeah,
get you something.
yeah,
Yeah, that's
it's
that's
nice.
beautiful. That's very
Yeah,
sweet. I like it.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Julie, do you have any kind of mementos, something like that, that you feel represents your ethos?
You know, I did have one thing, but it broke. Um, my wife got me this thing from HEB. It was like a Christmas ornament, and it's like a decorated longhorn skull Christmas ornament with kind of like a Dia de los Muertos paint job. It was something that HEB put out because that's the kind of thing HEB puts out. And my wife got that for me to actually commemorate the launch of the game. And of course, it fell off my desk and broke into a million pieces. But like
Oh,
that is felt connected to the ethos of the project and Radiant Array. And yeah, um, I'm looking around. I have a lot of random stuff. Most of it's just fun stuff that I like or that reminds me of my wife or my friends or whatever. Um, but yeah, I do also have a cat on my desk, and the cat is a little bit of mascot as well, and I mean a literal actual cat. This is Minotaur, and yeah, so
Minotaur, sweet baby,
yeah, she
so
counts,
sweet.
and I'm gonna put her back in her bed because she was dead asleep.
Sugar Skull Longhorn Skull from HEB is like the most Texas thing
Yeah,
I've ever conceived of. So yeah, I'm sorry it broke.
yeah, it
It
happens.
happens.
Yeah,
It happens.
yeah.
Mm, wonderful. So, is there anything that we haven't talked about today that would really feel like an important piece of the making or the understanding of Interstate 35 for y'all?
No, I mean, this has been a really good talk. I'm trying to think of anything specific that I'm like, oh, this needs to be mentioned. And not really. I mean, I think, the one thing is I would want to highlight again Josie's music and how fantastic it is and how core to the project it is. You know, when I was writing it, I was listening to a lot of the band Godspeed You, Black Emperor, um, which, they're a very political um, the technical genre term is post rock, and it's like long, complex, instrumental, almost symphonic arrangements with like rock band sounds. And I've just always been in love with that, and that music really captures very broad, sweeping operatic spaces really well. You really get that sense when listening to it, and I went to Josie and I said, I want something that both sounds Texasy and sounds like Godspeed You Black Emperor, but is also, its own thing. And Josie just knocked it the heck out of the park. And like it sounds exactly like I would want the project to sound and what, I would have imagined it to sound like. So I would just urge anyone, if you've listened to this conversation thus far, you should go pick up the soundtrack on Bandcamp. It's fantastic.
It's really good.
And yeah, the game wouldn't be half of what it is without that music. It's just so perfect. And so that's, the one thing.
I think the only thing I would add, honestly, is like I feel like we've talked about the Texas of it all and those things, and that's all true. The music is great to point out. The art's amazing, all that stuff. I think I think Julie's. I think a lot of narrative games and a lot of sci-fi or fantasy role playing games that they create a religion that's easy to get mad at, and that's easy to be resentful of, and that's easy to be um, that's easy to feel about. Like, where you stand because the experience with the created religion in front of you has lasted since the beginning of that game and will end when that game is over. I think Julie's handling of staring down the barrel of kind of growing up in a Christian church and like the complicated feelings that arise from that based on your lived experience well beyond the time spent in that building, is handled really deftly and is actually like, it's one of those things where it's like, okay, when you really think about it, it's like it's embarrassingly rare in games to be really talking about the Christian God and kind of growing up in the church and having very specific experiences. And like, I think a lot was said about that is not trite, and I think that's really impressive. So if you are someone like me who grew up in the church and then has complicated feelings about it as an adult, I think you'll find your emotions, complicated as they are, represented to you in a way that does not feel cloying or silly or something that you've heard a million times. So it's a long way to compliment Julie on her writing, but it's also just kind of a way of saying, like, I actually think this is fairly rare in the industry, and I think you should play it because it tackles this in a way that I don't see very often. So, yeah.
I think, you know, Julie's talent was so evident to anyone who was presented with the bones of this project. And I
Yeah.
think, you know, when there are people with those kinds of abilities, those kinds of viewpoints, it really connects with people. And
Yeah.
that I think there's something about this game that feels extremely topical in 2025
Yeah.
and probably will still feel relevant 10, 15 years from now.
Yeah, I agree. Totally.
Well, thanks. I don't have anything else to say to that. Everybody, yeah, this has been a really, really fantastic talk. If you're here from Ludo Naricon, Interstate 35 available on Steam. Um, it's not officially Steam Deck compatible, but if you go turn on Proton Experimental, it does work. So you can play it on your Steam Deck and check it out, and check out all the other fantastic games featured in this year's Ludo Naricon. And thank you to fellow Traveler for having us as an official selection for the con, and for doing such work to highlight good narrative games.
Yeah,
And
I would second that. I would second all of that. Yeah.
and if people want to find more from Julie, where can they find you?
Nowadays, I'm mostly on Blue Sky. My handle is julie.radiantarray.io, and I also have just a radiantarray.io account, but I forget to post there most of the time. So, like, if you want to keep up with stuff I'm working on, you know, what I'm up to, any of my work that ends up in public, that's gonna be where to find me. Yeah, and any other games I make will be made under Radiant Array. So also, you, I think you can follow our Steam page or whatever it is.
Yeah. And John, how about you? It sounds like you have so many projects, kind of Renaissance man of video games. Where can people check that out?
Yeah, I honestly, I'll just point you to the bio of my Blue Sky account. Just go to floppyadult.com on Blue Sky. All my stuff is in my bio. I'm not going to individually plug it. I did it one time on a different podcast, and I was so embarrassed by the end of it. I'll never do it again. So all my stuff is right there. Everyone's right. I am doing too much. There is a lot going on. But if you go to floppyadult.com over on Blue Sky, that's where I spend most of my time on social media. You'll be able to find everything I do, including a page for Honeybee Rodeo, my publisher, my publishing label. I've had multiple conversations after this point with several folks about publishing their games. You are welcome to send me an email and pitch me. I've not said yes to anything else yet because nothing has impressed me as much as Interstate 35 did. So I will say that. But yeah, floppyadult.com over on Blue Sky.
Wonderful. Well, again, I am Ariyeh Korvah, background artist for Interstate 35. Julie, John, thank you so much for joining me to talk about this fantastic game.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.